When your wife betrays you with your business partner, most men fall apart. I built an empire instead. My name is Alexander Lee. 8 years ago, I introduced my best friend to the woman I married. Last night, I saw them walk out of the same hotel. This is not a story of heartbreak. This is a story of precision, power, and revenge. The rain outside Alexander Lee's home office window provided a constant, rhythmic backdrop to the late-night scene. Inside, the cool blue glow of his computer screen cast sharp shadows on his face, reflecting the tense focus of his work. It was a typical evening, one of many long nights where Alexander found himself buried in company reports and data. Yet tonight was different. A notification popped up on his screen from his private investigator, Thomas Reed. It was the report he'd been waiting for. As Alexander opened the message, a chill ran through him. The images appeared one by one, each one reinforcing the gut-wrenching discovery he was about to make. The first photo showed his wife, Gloria, pulling into the parking garage of the Constellation Hotel. The timestamp read 7:45 p.m. on a Wednesday, precisely when she said she'd be having a quiet dinner with friends. The second photo made his breath catch. Gloria, dressed in a black cocktail dress, had emerged from the hotel elevator, but by then, she was wearing a striking red dress, one she had claimed was at the dry cleaners. The final photo was the one that made Alexander's blood run cold, his business partner, Russell Maxwell, walking out of the hotel behind Gloria, adjusting his tie. His grip on the mouse tightened as he scrolled through the pictures, his jaw clenching, but his fingers remained steady. The betrayal was now undeniable. A soft knock on the door broke his thoughts. Maria, their housekeeper, stood in the doorway with a message. "Mrs. Lee called," Maria said. "She says her dinner is running late and she won't be home until 11. Alexander's heart raced. Gloria always called him at precisely 9:45 p.m. on Wednesdays, the time when she had just finished dinner with friends. He looked at the clock, 9:45 p.m., the same time she always called. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. "Thank you, Maria. You can head home for the night." After Maria left, Alexander walked to his safe and retrieved a leather-bound notebook. Inside it, he had kept meticulous notes for years, everything from Gloria's changing passwords to her newfound interest in book club meetings, a bizarre development he had grown increasingly suspicious of. He wrote tonight's events in the notebook: her late dinner, the hotel, the red dress. His phone buzzed, interrupting his writing. It was a text from Jonathan Griffith, his corporate lawyer and oldest friend. "Got your message. Free for breakfast tomorrow? That diner on 7th? Alexander quickly typed back, 7 a.m. Bring everything you have on Russell's Singapore project. As he shut his laptop, Alexander walked to the window, his gaze lingering on the rain-soaked garden outside. 8 years of trust and partnership with Russell had built Lee and Maxwell Enterprises into a billion-dollar corporation. Yet tonight, everything he had built seemed to be crumbling in an instant. The quiet hum of the house was broken by the sound of heels clicking on marble. He listened as Gloria entered, her laugh echoing through the mansion, a laugh she had perfected at charity galas. He remained still, his mind racing as he listened to the familiar sounds, her purse being placed on the console table, her heels discarded on the floor, the rustle of her coat. "Alex," her voice carried up the stairs. "You still working, darling?" He composed his face into a mask of mild interest. "Just finishing up. How was dinner with Kate?" Gloria appeared in the doorway, her blonde hair damp from the rain. The red dress she had worn earlier was nowhere to be seen. "Oh, you know Kate, 3 glasses of wine and suddenly she's spilling all her dating drama," she said, walking over to kiss him on the cheek. He caught a familiar scent, a cologne he had noticed on Russell during their last board meeting. It made his stomach churn. "You work too hard, honey. Come to bed in a bit," she said, pouting playfully. "The company would collapse without you, wouldn't it?" She glanced at her phone as it buzzed, her expression flickering for a moment before she tucked it away. "Don't stay up too late," she added, leaving the room. Alexander stood frozen for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. As he returned to his desk, he opened a new email to Thomas Reed. Continue surveillance. Focus on the financial angle. I want to know every restaurant bill, every hotel charge, every gift purchased. Get me everything you can on Russell's personal accounts. As Alexander hit send, he couldn't help but reflect on how easily everything had unfolded. The memories of the day he had introduced Russell to Gloria at their company's 5th anniversary party came rushing back. Russell had been charming, charismatic, everything Alexander knew his wife appreciated. But now, those same qualities had become the groundwork for his betrayal. He wondered if that night had been the beginning, if every smile and touch had been a calculated move leading to this moment. The rain intensified outside, drowning out the sound of Gloria's shower upstairs. As Alexander pulled up the company's organizational chart on his computer, he studied the names and connections within the company. He realized something crucial: Russell may have Gloria, but Alexander had something far more valuable, an intricate network of loyal employees and board members who trusted his judgment. With enough documentation of Russell's questionable decisions, he would be able to bury him professionally. But it wasn't just Russell he had to worry about. Gloria had played her part in this betrayal too. As the tension in the house thickened, Alexander knew one thing for sure: his carefully laid plans for revenge were now set into motion, and nothing would stop him from taking back what was his. This discovery was just the beginning. Alexander would now begin the methodical process of dismantling the lives of those who had wronged him. Alexander sat in his office, his eyes fixed on the screen, where the details of his latest discovery unfolded before him. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly as he processed the information with the calmness of a seasoned strategist. His wife, Gloria, had betrayed him in the worst possible way, by not only cheating on him, but doing so with his business partner, Russell Maxwell. The cold, detached part of his mind registered the shock, but it wasn't a reaction fueled by emotion. It was business, a professional obstacle that needed to be dismantled. Revenge wasn't just about raw emotion, it was about precision, patience, and making the right moves at the right time. The discovery of Gloria's affair was a shock, but it was not a situation Alexander had not anticipated. In the world he inhabited, nothing was ever entirely secure. Trust, in both business and relationships, was an illusion. It wasn't so much the act of betrayal that surprised him, it was the scope of its implications. For a man like Alexander, whose world was built on control, to have this seismic disturbance in both his personal and professional life was more than an emotional blow. It was a challenge to his very foundation. As Alexander began to gather the evidence, he adopted a methodical approach. It wasn't enough to simply confirm the affair, he needed proof that would allow him to manipulate both his personal and professional circumstances to his advantage. This wasn't about a momentary outburst, this was about orchestrating a plan that would decimate his enemies, both in the personal and corporate realms. His mind raced through the possibilities, each more calculated than the last, as he pieced together the puzzle with a level of detachment that only someone as ruthless as he could maintain. The first part of his plan involved securing the most undeniable evidence. Thomas Reed, his private investigator, had already sent over the photos. The sight of them, the images of Gloria entering the hotel, followed by Russell, wasn't enough. He needed to dig deeper, to make sure every piece of the puzzle was complete. He needed financial records, hotel bills, and even private messages exchanged between the two. Alexander knew that without this crucial evidence, his plan would lack the ammunition it needed to destroy Russell and Gloria completely. However, simply having the photographs wasn't enough. The images, in and of themselves, were damning but insufficient for the type of war he was preparing to wage. He needed more documents, the trace of their secret meetings, their emails, and texts. Every minute detail would be used to his advantage. He knew the value of information in his world. Information was power. So, he methodically instructed Reed to follow them more closely, to track their financial transactions, and to record their every move. His mind was already working through the implications of the evidence, he could already see how it would play out in the grand scheme of things. At the same time, Alexander was preparing his professional tactics. Russell Maxwell, his business partner, wasn't just a simple accomplice in this betrayal. He was a pivotal figure in Lee and Maxwell Enterprises, a company that Alexander had spent years building from the ground up. The betrayal wasn't just a personal slight, it threatened the foundation of everything he had worked for. Russell had been his right-hand man, a trusted ally in their shared business journey, but now he was an adversary. This was no longer just about a personal betrayal, it was about survival, about protecting everything he had fought for. The company was his empire, his legacy, and no one, not even his wife, would be allowed to take that from him. The emotional ramifications of the betrayal were undeniable. It wasn't just the shock of being deceived, but the reality that everything he had built was now at risk. This wasn't a betrayal that could be ignored or swept under the rug. It was too public, too damaging. And that was why Alexander couldn't afford to let his emotions rule his decisions. He couldn't afford to react impulsively or out of anger. No, he needed to be calm, rational, and strategic. His emotions had no place in this. If anything, his ability to detach himself from the situation gave him the edge he needed. He wasn't driven by hurt or revenge, he was driven by the cold logic of a businessman seeking to protect his interests. The next step was to manipulate the situation in such a way that Russell's position would be destroyed. Alexander wasn't one to act rashly. Patience was his weapon of choice. He had been building a case against Russell for months, quietly collecting small details, observing patterns in Russell's behavior, and documenting discrepancies in his work. Now, with the affair exposed, he could use that leverage. He had already arranged for Jonathan Griffith, his corporate lawyer and longtime friend, to help him draft the necessary legal actions. The wheels of justice would begin to turn, but Alexander had no intention of letting the law decide Russell's fate. He would orchestrate Russell's fall from grace, making it inevitable. It wasn't just about making Russell pay, it was about removing him from the equation entirely, ensuring that no one could question Alexander's authority or the legitimacy of his actions. He began by revisiting the company's financial statements, looking for any discrepancies or patterns of behavior that could be twisted into something damning. Russell's career, built on a foundation of trust, was now under Alexander's scrutiny. Every mistake, every misstep, would be used to turn the board against him. In the meantime, Alexander kept his distance from the emotional turmoil. He could not afford to be seen as a man betrayed, but rather as a CEO in full control of his company. He kept his interactions with his employees professional, never allowing his personal feelings to interfere with his decisions. He had to maintain the facade of the confident, unshakable leader. Any sign of weakness would make him vulnerable, not just to Russell and Gloria, but to everyone else within his company who might see an opportunity to take advantage of his distraction. For Alexander, power was not just about being in control, it was about the perception of control. If the people around him saw him as anything less than the powerful, unyielding figure he had cultivated over the years, it would undermine everything he had worked for. That perception was just as important as the reality. So he continued to act with cold, deliberate efficiency, staying one step ahead of both his enemies and those loyal to him. The most crucial part of his strategy was precision. He had gathered enough information, but he needed to know exactly when to strike. Timing was everything. He had already positioned himself for the moment when he would present the evidence to the board of directors, ensuring that they would see Russell's actions for what they were, a breach of trust that would irrevocably damage the company. At the same time, he had to make sure that Gloria would be forced into a corner. There could be no room for negotiation, no way for her to redeem herself in the eyes of the public. She had chosen her side, and Alexander was determined to make sure that side would be her undoing. As he reviewed the latest evidence, Alexander's resolve only grew. He had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and now that it was finally within his grasp, he felt the power surge within him. Every move had been carefully calculated, every detail planned. The outcome was no longer in question. It was inevitable. The only thing left was to execute his plan with flawless precision. With the pieces falling into place, Alexander prepared for the final phase of his plan. It would be a careful execution, a calculated release of information that would devastate both Russell and Gloria. He would use every tool at his disposal, his network of loyal employees, his legal expertise, and the irrefutable evidence he had painstakingly collected. There would be no room for error. As the night wore on, Alexander sat in his office, his mind racing with the endless possibilities that lay ahead. He had already secured the first step, exposing the affair. But it wasn't enough to simply reveal the truth. It was about wielding the truth as a weapon, using it to dismantle everything his enemies held dear. The clock ticked on, and with each passing second, Alexander's resolve grew stronger. The plan was set, and nothing would stand in his way. In the coming days, as Alexander would begin executing his plan, the balance of power would shift. The empire he had built with Russell would soon be his alone, and the betrayal would serve as the catalyst for his ultimate rise. There was no turning back now. His revenge was not only inevitable, but it was also strategically flawless. But as the plan moved forward, Alexander would come to realize that the true cost of revenge was far greater than he could have ever imagined. Alexander's world had been turned upside down. The cold, calculated individual who had built an empire from the ground up was now thrust into an emotional battlefield he hadn't anticipated. The discovery of Gloria's affair with his business partner, Russell Maxwell, was not only a personal betrayal, it was a direct assault on everything Alexander had worked to build. The emotional toll was immense, yet Alexander, in his unflinching way, detached himself from the mess of feelings swirling inside him. The pain was there, but it didn't have a place in his strategy. His mind focused on one thing: revenge. His emotional detachment was both a shield and a weapon. For Alexander, emotions were dangerous, especially when mixed with decisions that required precision and control. The more he processed the betrayal, the more his mind turned to strategy. The details of Gloria's affair had to be used as a weapon, not to satisfy personal vengeance, but to bring down those who had betrayed him in the most profound way possible. While others might have been consumed by rage or grief, Alexander calmly surveyed the battlefield that lay before him, ready to manipulate it to his advantage. The first obstacle, of course, was confronting Gloria. When she returned home that night, Alexander could feel the tension in the air. Her footsteps echoed in the mansion's empty halls, her laughter too practiced to be genuine. She had no idea that the man she had betrayed was no longer the husband who cared for her, but a CEO calculating his next move. She smiled, kissed him on the cheek, and played the part of the dutiful wife, but Alexander saw it all differently now. He saw nothing but a woman who had chosen her side, a woman who had abandoned him for Russell. And yet, despite the betrayal, he played his role. He responded with the calmness of a man who knew everything, but refused to show it. There could be no rush, no outburst, just the quiet control that he was known for. Gloria, for her part, did not realize that Alexander was already planning her downfall. Her attempts to maintain control over her narrative, claiming dinners with friends, pretending the affair was something it wasn't, were all too obvious. She tried to maintain the facade of a loving wife, the woman she had been before Alexander discovered the truth. But Alexander knew better. She could lie to him, but she couldn't lie to herself. Every little action, every subtle shift in her behavior, added to the growing stack of evidence he was accumulating. The lies she told him only solidified his resolve. Meanwhile, Russell had no idea what was coming. He thought he was untouchable, that his long-standing partnership with Alexander had made him a permanent fixture in Lee and Maxwell Enterprises. He had been a trusted confidant, an ally in business. That was all over now. To Alexander, Russell's betrayal was an unforgivable breach. But Russell wasn't going to go down without a fight, and Alexander knew that. Russell's position had to be taken apart piece by piece. That would require patience, precision, and an understanding of how to use leverage. This wasn't about confronting Russell directly, it was about creating a situation so dire that he had no way of getting out. The emotional fallout for Alexander was immense, but it was a price he was willing to pay. Every time he spoke to Gloria, every time he sat in meetings with Russell, the emotional weight of what had happened threatened to take over. But he wouldn't let it. He would not allow himself to become weak or distracted. His primary goal was clear: revenge. And for that, he needed control, not just of his emotions, but of his environment. He knew that if he allowed himself to get too caught up in the betrayal, if he let his anger or hurt guide him, it would be impossible to outmaneuver those who had wronged him. Alexander's interactions with his employees, his colleagues, even his closest friends, were marked by an emotional coldness. He couldn't afford to show any vulnerability. He had to be the unshakable leader they all looked to for guidance. His control over his company was what kept him centered. The betrayal of his wife and business partner, while deeply painful, was something that had to be compartmentalized. His company, his legacy, needed to be preserved. And to do that, he needed to make sure that the board of directors, his business partners, and anyone else who could challenge him, saw him as strong, unwilling to let personal matters interfere with business. But the toll the betrayal took on his psyche was undeniable. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about everything he had built being threatened. His trust in the people closest to him had been shattered, and that would have consequences beyond what even he could predict. The emotional distance he maintained was both a defense mechanism and a strategic move. It allowed him to think clearly, but it also put a barrier between him and the people around him. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not even to Gloria, who was still pretending as though everything was normal. She was trying to regain control of the situation by maintaining appearances, but Alexander knew that the real power lay in his ability to control the narrative. The affair, the betrayal, it was all part of the story he was now writing. As he carefully navigated this emotional minefield, he also had to keep his eye on the long-term strategy. Russell was a powerful adversary, but Alexander had one thing he didn't: control over the situation. With the evidence in hand, Alexander was ready to make his move. But it wasn't just about exposing the truth, it was about using that truth to dismantle